Welcome, everybody, to a Comic-Con panel titled Fantasy Evolutions and Revolutions. And we got quite the esteemed panel to talk about the way fantasy is changing and evolving, which is, I think we have a great selection of panelists to cover that topic. They've given me some brief bios, and I always get bored whenever I'm at a panelist and there's that droning on of people's bios. So I'm going to keep it very brief, and then I'm going to open it up for everybody, maybe give the elevator pitch, that thumbnail description of your current book, and then we'll dive into the topics. We only have 45 minutes. First up, I've got Shelley Parker Chan. Shelley is an Australian by way of Malaysia and New Zealand, a 2017 Tiptree Fellow and former diplomat on human rights and gender equality and LGBT rights in Southeast Asia. And we're excited to have her talking about her forthcoming debut historical fantasy novel, She Who Became the Sun. And we also have Shelley, you want to wave? I'm sure your name's there, but you can feel free to wave. There's Christopher, again, I'm sorry, I forgot to ask your pronunciation of your last name.
Buhelman.
Buhelman. Thank you, Christopher.
You're welcome.
Christopher is an author and comedian and screenwriter from St. Petersburg, Florida. So he's probably very sweaty right now. He tours the country most years, writing and performing at Renaissance festivals. He and his wife travel with a rescue dog, Duck. And that is my rescue dog I just adopted 2 days ago.
Oh, congratulations.
Impulse buy at Petco. He and his wife travel with a rescue dog, Duck, and a black cat named Jane Mansfield, who is proficient in ninjutsu. His recently released novel is The Blacktongue Thief. Moving on to T.L. Huchu, or Tende. Tende's previous books, The Hairdresser of Harare, and The Maestro, and The Magistrate, and The Mathematician, so he's been busy, has been translated to multiple languages, and his short fiction has won awards. Huchu grew up in Zimbabwe, but has lived in Edinburgh for most of his adult life. Very cool. His fantasy debut, The Library of the Dead, was just published June 1st from Tor. Next up is Brian Staveley. He's taught literature, religion, history, philosophy, all subjects that influence his writing, and holds an MA in creative writing from Boston University. I feel very honored and embarrassed to be speaking in front of him. He works as editor at Antaliva Press and has published poetry and essays both in print and online. He lives in Vermont and divides his time between running trails, splitting wood, writing, and urchin wrangling. His most recent fantasy novel, The Empire's Ruin, is just out from Tor. Then we have Nghi Vo. She is the author of acclaimed novellas When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain, which I loved, and The Empress of Salt and Fortune, a Hugo Award and Ignite Award finalist, and the winner of the Crawford Award, so very distinguished. Born in Illinois, she lives on the shores of Lake Michigan. Born in Chicago myself, so great to hear for somebody up in the northern Illinois area. She believes in the ritual of lipstick, the power of stories, and the right to change your mind. The Chosen, the Beautiful, her debut novel, is just out from Tor.com Publishing, and it's getting rave reviews across the nation. So that is everybody. And again, maybe we'll just start from the start with Shelley and maybe give that elevator pitch of what your story's about.
All right. So this is She Who Became the Sun. It's my debut novel, and it's a queer reimagining of the rise to power of the founding emperor of the Ming Dynasty. So it's set in the 14th century, and it's based on a historical figure who was a peasant who became a monk and then a rebel commander, and he built an army, and he kicked out the Mongols out of China, who were ruling China at the time, and he made himself the emperor, which is pretty impressive. I think you got to agree. And he was a terrible guy. Really awful, a tyrant. And I thought, let's make this super ambitious guy someone who's not a guy, and see how it goes. So I had a lot of fun with making that queer and someone who wasn't a man. Very
cool. Christopher, you're up next.
Yeah, The Blacktongue Thief is sort of a dystopian, high medieval first-person narrative. It follows a thief by the name of Kinch, who's heavily indebted to the Takers Guild, or the Thieves Guild, and they send him on a quest to square things up, and he finds himself trailing along with a hardened veteran of the Goblin Wars named Galva. And then they end up with another companion, a witch named Norgal. And the world is bleak because it follows a series of goblin wars that devastated humanity. But it is leavened by, I hope, by the narrative of Kinch, who is our guide through all this.
And your ogres are, I think, the worst creations I've ever read. Those are quite
the goblins. Yeah.
Quite horrific.
Thank you.
So, well done.
Thanks.
Tende, why don't we move on to you? Oh, you're muted, just so you know.
Yeah, it had to be me, right?
always happens.
So the Library of the Dead is about Ropa Moyo, a young girl who talks to ghosts for a living. She lives in a slum just outside of Edinburgh. And one day, one of her spectral clients asks her to find a missing child. Initially, she's reluctant, but she gets dragged into it. And this sort of leads her to the darker side, or to discover the darker side of Scottish magic. So she'll discover an occult library, and she'll battle villainous villains like the Midnight Milkman. Yeah, so it's a rollicking romp across sort of slightly dystopian Edinburgh.
Very cool. Brian, on to you.
The Empire's Ruin is a new installment in the world that I've been writing in for the last bunch of years. It has kind of a lot of the elements of classic epic fantasy. There's quests, there's monsters, there's politics, but really I think it's about the psychological fallout and ramifications of war and violence. That's what all the characters are struggling with.
Very cool. Nghi Vo.
I just wrote The Chosen the Beautiful, which came out on June 1st, and it is a retelling of the Great Gatsby novel from the point of view of Jordan Baker, who in my version just happens to be queer, magical, and Vietnamese American. Although I'm going to contend that she started out as queer in the original novel, so I'm just going to let that one go.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to reading that. I'm a huge Great Gatsby fan, so I'm curious on your take on that. So it should be fantastic. So let's move on to some questions I have for you. I've taught writing occasionally, and, I hear from editors, and excuse me if there's any of the editors listening, they usually tell those new writers out there, give us something new, give us something we've never seen before. And unfortunately, if you ever do that, they're just not going to buy your book, because they don't, if you give them something too strange and outlandish, it confuses them. They don't know where to shelve that book at Barnes and Nobles. So I always think that, when it comes to trying to give them what they want, to give them that something new, something they haven't seen before, is to generally, find a genre and learn, read deeply on that genre, learn the tropes, that what's tired, what's new, what's fresh, and then trying to find some way of tweaking that. You all picked fantasy as a genre. Some have started out in this genre. Others have moved on from a different genre, like myself. I moved from fantasy to thrillers back to fantasy. First, I guess we'll start there. Why fantasy? Now, some of you have moved to fantasy, some of you started there, but why? What stirred you to want to work in the world of fantasy? So let's go ahead and just start with. Let's go backwards. Let's start with this mix up. Let's go with Tende first. Hope you're still muted again.
Oh God, I'm just gonna leave it unmuted for now. Sorry, guys.
Tende muted.
It's one of those days. So I think fantasy is like the oldest sort of form of storytelling that you get. I mean, if you think of all the ancient folktales and stuff that have lasted all this time, they tend to be within the genre of the fantastic. It's sort of like the earliest sort of way we have of trying to understand the world. And certainly I sort of like got into it because it just brings out the inner child in me. It's that thing in the corner of your eye, the shadow. It's that creaking that happens at night when you're in bed. And it's a lot of fun, but it can tell some really profound truths at the same time. Yeah.
Christopher.
Yeah, my first 5 novels were horror novels with Penguin Random House, and I really enjoyed sort of the roller coaster of safe fear you get in horror. And moving to fantasy was delightful. I mean, well, first of all, I write in these genres because that's just what I enjoy reading. Fantasy is, you know, pure imagination, pure invention. I mein, you have to do some practical research and such to make it grounded and believable. But really, I just love being able to define the parameters of a world and then people and creature that world. So yeah, it's the purest form of storytelling to me.
How about Nghi Vo? Nghi.
Well, I've been a fantasy reader since I was a reader. So, you know, if I can't have dragons and elves and then why am I here? But I think the thing that really cemented it for me was when I was doing some research on World War II, and I got kind of invested in the Soviet T-34 tanks, which were, you know, just sort of changed the face of warfare in Stalingrad. And then I just thought, what if they were dragons? And then I just kept thinking about the structure of power. What happens if we do have dragons? How does that level of playing field, or how does that make it dramatically uneven? It was such a world shift and such a wonderful way to confront what if that I sort of lost my taste for just about anything else and charged in with dragons that used to be tanks.
How about Shelley? How about you?
Yeah, I actually come out of the romance community, so maybe a bit different from you guys. The thing about romance is if you write contemporary, it's very hard to get like really high stakes. It sometimes like descends into the terrible miscommunication of idiots. But with fantasy, you can really go escapist, you can go big, you can have, you know, really world-defining stakes. The tragedies are truly tragic. The revenge is truly, you know, vengeful. You can have a lot more murder, maybe. But I actually didn't write a fantasy. This book that I sold was a historical fiction. But then I sold it to Tor, and they were like, you should probably have some magic in it. So that was a second layer edition. But it made it better. It made it more fun, I think.
Yeah, my first novel I wrote was I thought it was science fiction. And my editor at HarperCollins said, no, you're writing a modern day thriller. And I go, but I got telepathic marsupial creatures that live underneath Antarctica. But I don't care. You're set in the modern times, or therefore we're going to sell it as a modern thriller. So again, they have to shelve that book somewhere. So I'm glad that you persevered. And let's move on to Brian.
I just love the phrase, the terrible miscommunication of idiots. That seems like a whole genre unto itself. I agree with a lot of what everybody else has said. There's the magic that comes with writing fantasy that I associate with like childlike wonder. You know, I have a 9-year-old and we're always out in the woods discovering the places where the trolls have bedded down and, you know, where the fairies live. And fantasy just feels like an extension of the way that I've always loved exploring the world. But also what other people have said just about the scope is that fantasy really can encompass and harbor all of these other things. It can harbor horror and mystery and romance. And it's delightful to be able to subsume all those different kinds of stories in, you know, in one novel, in one series. So that the scope of fantasy really feels like the politics just feels almost endless.
Definitely. The topic is evolutions and revolutions. We're talking about, you know, how fantasy is moving forward and how hopefully we are all attempting to do that. The ways we're trying to find unique ways of telling fantasy stories in a world that has survived on Tolkien and Games of Thrones. And can you tell us, you know, on each of your novels, how you think that you know, you move that fantasy genre in a different direction that we haven't seen before? I'm particularly interested in you, Shelley, since you layered in, you know, magic into story. How was that? I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, people didn't understand what genre I was writing in. So I'm actually writing in a really well-defined Chinese genre, the Chinese palace drama that it's like palace intrigue. All the TV shows are set. Like you tend to have like the emperor and his harem, and there's a lot of intrigue and battles. There's generals. There's a lot of backstabbing. Is a form that's actually clearly defined with its own tropes and its own style. And the style is what we in the West think of as quite a high fantasy style. It's quite swashbuckling. It's fun. There are big stakes. But when you bring it over here, people are like, oh, it looks like a historical, but it's not historically accurate because it plays with history. It usually uses real historical characters, but in fun ways. It gives them new motivations. It can play with their gender. So eventually I found people who got it, but they were like, add magic later. And the magic does make it a bit more Western in concept, but I think that's fun. It's a mishmash, kind of like I am, of East and West. So it has the Chinese palace drama and a bit of Star Wars and a bit of, this, that, and the other. But I think people, when you look outside of the West, you'll find that there are lots of other interesting fantasy genres. I think people know about wuxia, which is like the martial arts fantasy of China. Is quite popular in movies, but now we're seeing it in books as well, which is a fun way to take fantasy.
Cool. Now, Nghi, you challenge us to look at gender in a new way, to look at stories in a new way. You talked about inventing. It's not just a matter of adding a different gender into Great Gatsby. You have a whole layer of magic in that story also. We'd like to talk about that a little bit.
When it comes right down to it, I think Chosen the Beautiful came from a lot of places, but it definitely came from me as a teenager who was given The Great Gatsby. As I was an AP student, so I got it around about the age of 14 or 15, and there is nothing like me in there. I related it to it because it was so many big feelings, and when you're a teenager, you're all big feelings. Everything is towering, everything is grand. It didn't come to meet me as the person I am or the person I was at all. So for The Chosen the Beautiful, I wanted to, in the most grandiose and the most self-aggrandizing way, I wanted to put myself into it. And with regards to your question about how we are pushing the field forward and pushing ourselves into it as well, the easiest way I can say it is I've never met myself in that kind of work before. I would like to, and I'm going to make everyone else deal with it.
Perfect. Christopher, we've wandered into the world of Goblin Wars. Yeah. Now, again, I've read your book. It definitely has that very sort of sword and sorcery, swashbuckling fantasy that I love to read. Can you tell us how you're pushing the genre in a new direction? I have the answer, but I'll see if you have the answer. I'll see if you have the correct answer.
Oh, good. Yes, I hope I do well. I wanted to. Again, I wanted to present kind of a dystopian thing, so I did that and I wanted to get rid of two tropes that we are used to with fantasy. And what I wanted to see if I could work without was the idea of the man on the horse. And in this world, the goblins brewed up a plague called the Stumbles, which killed all of our horses. And they did that as a military development. And so you have, it was such a challenge to imagine a world without equine friends to help us. And that was something you realized just how much you rest on that in the medieval world. But more significantly, I wanted to sort of take the historical example of, what happened in Europe after World War I, where a whole generation of men went off to fight and many didn't come back or came back very different. And I wanted to actually amp that up. And in this world, we're facing these brutal goblins, which are a competing species who regard us as a food source. And in a series of 3 wars, the worst of which was the middle one, we lost an entire generation of men, and then had to send a generation of women under arms. And the result of that is flipping the traditional patriarchal medieval world very much on its head. So when you have random encounters with thieves or pirates or whatever, there's every bit as good a chance, a better chance it's going to be a female than a male. And also there's a whole generation of kids missing because there wasn't any time for all of that during the last 2 wars.
And your book is also very funny, by the way.
I'm glad you think so.
You make it sound like it's a grim, and it is grim. I mean, I think you used every possible version of the word blood in the book, but it also is very funny. So I don't want people to be scared away from sounding like, oh, it's going to be a horrible trip. It's actually, it is a fun, brutal trip to go on. And me as a former veterinarian, of course, I hated that you killed all the horses. So yes,
yeah,
that was horrible. Brian, you continue your story in the Unhewn Throne universe. Why did you return? And was it something, another story you wanted to tell? Was it is there something unique you wanted to bring out in that world that you want to explore further in this new cycle of stories?
Yeah, I mean, the end of every story is just the beginning of another story, right? But I want to say, just not even on my book, like just listening to all these descriptions, I haven't read any of the books from the fellow panelists, but it's just so exciting. One of my great loves is listening to Baroque music, and I love the idea of form and variation, and just seeing how, composers will layer on, will have different approaches to a form like the fugue, or the poets will have different approaches to a form like the villanelle or the sonnet, or whatever form it is that you're working within. And I feel like fantasy is that writ large, especially right now, where people are describing their books and their characters sometimes explicitly in terms of, hey, there's this pre-existing idea. I wanted to work with that and break it in some ways and remake it in some ways and make it my own. I just think that's like a super exciting, that's like my favorite thing with art. I have one of these books around here somewhere, paintings of the crucifixion, and it's just paintings of the crucifixion for 600 years. And I love just flipping through it. With my book, I don't know, each of the books is interrogating a different thing, but this one, I guess, it's looking at the redemption arc. There's a lot of redemption arcs in fantasy. I wanted to make the redemption more difficult and to my mind, more real. It's not just a matter of, hey, you really messed up and a lot of people died, and then you get a couple chapters and it's all okay. But you messed up and a lot of people died and now you're broken. Then what? So that's what I was tackling in one of the plot lines in this book.
Very cool. Tende, you have a fascinating background that you fold into your story with this character that is from Zimbabwe, now living in Edinburgh, and you can definitely relate to that. Can you tell the genesis of that character? How much of that character is you? How much of that character is your own, who you want to be? And how do you think you took the fantasy genre in a new direction with your story?
Oh God, if the character was like me, you'd have to put me in a straitjacket or something. She's definitely a lot more ballsy than I am. But what I actually had to do while I was writing The Library of the Dead was to play around with language. You see, English is my second language. And so my usage of it tends to be pretty formal and stilted because it's a language that I learned in school.
Sure. And
in order to sort of have something a little more dynamic, I kind of slangified it. I used quite a bit of Scots in the novel, which is what a lot of people out here speak. Now, Scots is, some people describe it as a dialect of English, but it is its own language with its own special words and terminologies, which makes that novel really local to Edinburgh. I think what I did that was new, if at all, was I really concentrated a lot on, what we would do if magic was a real thing, which would be what we do with everything else, monetize it. So there's a big sort of financial imperative behind sort of everything that's going on in that universe. But the great thing is Edinburgh is also the city of Adam Smith, the economist. So I can play around with these old ideas from the Scottish Enlightenment. Yeah.
Very cool. I look forward to reading. I haven't had a chance to read the book, but it's on my I'm just fascinated by the whole idea of this girl that could talk to ghosts, and that I was intrigued by one of the descriptions where a ghost is penniless and can't afford her services. I'm thinking, how does a ghost carry money? And I'm just curious how that's going to happen. So I can't wait to.
It's called reverse charge. Some of us were old enough to remember when you could do that by telephone.
Okay, so Christopher, you brought up a good topic in regards to, the topic's evolution and revolution, and usually when you evolve or revolution occurs, you're leaving something behind. You talked about, a trope, the man on the horse that you wanted to see set aside as a unique way of moving the story forward. Are there any tropes that any of you all would think that feel so tired? You're tired of reading it, you're tired of seeing it, you wish that could drop by the wayside? And I'm going to go with Brian first.
No. And the reason is, it's not that there aren't tropes that I'm tired of, but I almost want to see them tackled again and tackled differently. I feel like there used to be a game, I don't know if it's really happening anymore, but there used to be a thing where people would kind of like hunt around in novels and be like, I found a trope, there's another trope, this book is full of tropes. And I was always mystified by that. I was like, of course it's full of tropes. The question is, did the author handle them well and in a new and interesting way or not? Like, the fact that you're a trope detective, I don't think adds any real criticism to the book. So even the tropes that I don't like, especially the tropes that I don't like, I'm excited to see someone take them on and do something interesting or new or better with them. So no, I don't want to see anything retired. I want to see it reworked and remade.
Rather than going name by name, which can get a little tedious and repetitive, does anybody have any tropes that they really would like to see fall by the wayside? Since you can raise your hand. Yes, Nghi.
I will always take a new take on an old trope. I will say I'm pretty tired of the chosen one trope. It's weird, it's focused, and it has always felt very artificial to me. I would actually also like to see the retirement of the obsession with grimdark subject. Like Shelley mentions being from Romance Land, and one of the things I always appreciate about Romance Land is the guaranteed happy ending, which still doesn't take away any of the pleasure. And there can be so much pleasure, even if you know that everyone's going to be okay at the end. And that's something I would like to see more of and less of with regards to the grimdark stuff.
Anybody else? Any personal pet peeves in the fantasy world? No, let's move on. Oh, yes, Shelly, go ahead.
I've got one. Actually, I'm a big defender of tropes. I love tropes. I come from romance, as Nghi said. Romance is all about tropes, and we love seeing them done in new and different ways. But I'm slightly over that whole a woman gets raped and takes revenge, or the whole fridging of someone as their backstory. I am kind of like, I personally no longer want to see that. Although there is that movie, is it called A Promising Young Woman, which I think has that whole trope in it. So maybe it can still be done and done well, but I'm hesitant.
Okay, moving on. Let's avoid the tropes and go on to another topic. Again, when I ever teach writing, I always ask my students to define the difference between fiction and nonfiction. And the usual answer is, one's true and one's not. And while, most of that's true, that's certainly not always the case. There's sometimes fiction is based on fact, sometimes nonfiction is dramatized with creative license. But down to its fundamentalist level, to me, the nonfiction's main objective is to pass on facts and information. It can be done in an entertaining way, an exciting way, in a creative way, but your basic goal when you're writing nonfiction is to pass on facts and information to your reader. The primary goal of fiction is to pass on emotion. You're trying to stir that reader to get them to respond at a fundamental human level. Can you sort of maybe share in your stories, what was your sort of emotional goal in the story? What were you trying to get your right? What were you trying to stir in your writers? Was it just a pure adrenaline rush? Was it breaking readers' hearts? Stir the reader to understand the other better, or something else? And all of the above is a fine answer, by the way, or none of the above is a fine answer. But I'm just curious, what were you hoping to stir in your reader with your stories? I'm going to jump into Nghi first.
Well, I of course want all of my readers, at the end of the day, I want them to feel satisfied. I want them to be happy with whatever they invested in my book. One thing that shocked me was realizing that I not only had a book coming out, I had a hardcover book coming out, is about $25 or so, and it's like 2 or 3 meals depending on who you are. So at the end of the day, I want them to be worth it. I want whatever time they spent with me and whatever money they spent on me to be worth the price of entry.
And Brian, how about you? I think you've sort of almost answered this already, but
yeah, I had a big late night fight with a friend of mine this past weekend about this. I hadn't seen this college buddy in a long time, and he was grilling me. I want readers to like my book for a variety of reasons, ranging from the financial to the altruistic. But really, when I'm writing, I really just have to chase down the stuff that is interesting to me. And sometimes I have veered towards, fans will say they want this, or an editor will say, well, maybe you could do this. And I've tried to do that. And if it's not the thing that the psychological angle or that I'm interested in chasing down, it almost never works. So this book, The Empire's Ruin, was a risk for me because this character, one of the main characters, spends a lot of the book with PTSD, maybe the whole book, maybe beyond the book. And I thought, I don't know if people want to read about that, but that was what I needed to explore with that character for this book. And so I hope people like it. I hope people are interested. We'll see.
Tende, how about you? What was your goal, and what were you trying to stir in your readers with this book?
I just wanted them to have a lot of fun. I mean, the main protagonist, Roper, is poor, but still, she still retains all of her humanity, and sort of like it's to subvert certain stereotypes and expectations that we have of people that are in difficult circumstances, and say the human experience is still fundamentally the same despite your station. But ultimately, I have a lot of ideas that I put in there, but I just want you to have fun, because when I grab a book, I mean, when I was younger and like into Russian literature and all that stuff, I wanted to read something boring and depressing and hardcore. But now I'm at a stage where I've seen all those profound meditations on the human condition and all that bollocks. And I'm like, you have to entertain me first. And I'm trying to entertain as well as present certain ideas that are valuable to me. Yeah.
Shelley, how about you?
Yeah, same. I just really want people to have a great time. The whole genre of Chinese historical dramas is catharsis and fun. So what I wrote was a rise to power, and I guess the engine of that rise to power is that emotional feeling of, the person who everyone tells is nothing and worthless, and you're a nobody, you're invisible. And it's like, well, screw you. I am going to rise and I'm going to become the emperor. I'm going to become the biggest, baddest person in the world. And for that person to be someone who isn't traditionally even allowed in that role is a special kind of catharsis, Take a girl and get them to be the emperor is, I hope people get that feeling at the end.
That's a good emotional response, is the F yeah. Yep, perfect. Christopher.
There we are. I can't improve too much on what Tende said and what has been said thus far, and Brian as well. I both write things that interest me, and I also write to entertain. But the way in which I hope specifically to entertain in the Blacktongue Thief is I just want the reader to feel like they've just gone on a huge adventure. I want the reader to laugh and feel afraid and feel some romance and also to have a sense of wonder, at traveling. This is a quest book, and you get to see a lot of cities, and I really enjoy travel. I enjoy reading about travel. So there's an element of that in there as well.
Perfect. I was suggested a list of questions to ask you guys. And one of them, I thought, well, this is stupid. I'm not going to ask that question. But then I got thinking about it. I'm really curious about this question.
A stupid question.
Is that, write it for me. We write, at least for me, I write to escape, and for a paycheck. But mostly to escape, because I was writing before I ever got a paycheck. I always pitied my client that would come to the veterinary office after lunch when I was writing, because I was still somewhat stuck in that story. So I have a hard time giving them the attention they properly deserve because I had one foot in that other world still. I'm not quite prepared to reemerge into this world. And so the question they asked was, would you want to live in the world you wrote? And if so, who would you want to be in that world? Would you want to be the hero? Would you want to be the villain? An active participant? An observer with the bag full of popcorn? How much of that world are you attached to, enamored with? Would you want to live there, and how? So I'm going to jump and ask Christopher to answer that first, because heaven knows that's not a fun place to. Your world is not that fun.
No, I wouldn't want to visit the world as it is when the leader encounters it, but I'll tell you, I would probably love to visit it before the goblins came, because it's a world with fun games. There's a card game called Towers that I've actually made into a working game, and I hope to actually have out eventually. And I really geek out on literal world building, making the map, figuring out what cultures are where, and if there are rough analogs in our world. For Christmas, my wife found this company that will make a parchment version of a map, and this guy Tim Paul made the map that's in Blacktongue Thief, and I've got this up on the wall right here, and I'm gonna plug this here. And I just love. Oh, I'm not doing this well. I'm not doing this well at all. Hold on. I love coastlines, right? I would love to go to like Galardia and live on the Cassine Sea, which is just there on the right of the screen. That kind of that bay in there. I wonder. Is it? It's probably very Mediterranean feeling there. It's probably got really beautiful pine trees going up, rock cliffs. And I know that country has great culture. They're famous for how beautiful their coins are. I think that even when there's a lot of horror going on, and it's sort of been a dominant theme in that world. I mean, there's a lot of beauty too, and I hope you managed to find pockets of beauty in there when you were reading it as well.
Well, I heard that the cost of timeshares isn't that bad in that bay. You can probably afford one. Certain part of the year, you need to pick, the proper time of year.
Sure.
Should be good to go. And how many of us are now extremely jealous of Christopher that he has a colored map of his world on his wall? I am very jealous. Brian.
It's hard because I love adventure. I at various points in my life have done a lot of rock climbing and mountaineering in different parts of the world, and right now I do a lot of mountain biking with my son. But the trade-off of adventure is risk and danger, and I'm acutely aware of the fact that there's survivorship bias. So a lot of the great adventures in either real history or in fantasy that we hear about because those are the people who didn't get an arrow in the head or die of dysentery or get malaria or be gored by a hippo or like any of the million horrible things that can happen to you. So in real life, I'm always trying to make that balance of like, well, I want to have an awesome and unique and exciting experience, but I also want to, be able to walk at the end of it. And I have to say, I think I would be afraid to go adventure in my world. I think it would be a level of risk that was too high for my risk-reward assessment. Although, as Christopher said, I'm sure I could find a nice little fishing shack on the seashore, stay out of the worst of the troubles, hope not to get some kind of disease, and just live out my days in relative peace and joy. So,
Shelly, how about you in ancient China? Is that some place you would want to live?
I have a friend who writes time travel books, and we're always joking about how, if you're a minority or like a female AFAB person or queer person, time travel is actually a horror story. You time travel in Australia back to a genocide. Yeah, that would be heaps fun. I would. Ancient China. Well, I don't speak Chinese, so I'd be screwed for a start. They speak Middle Chinese, so even worse. I'm mixed race, so I don't know. Would I find like the Frankish merchant community and like hang out with Marco Polo? I don't know. I like to think that 2,000 years of like having the importance of exams like hammered into you means like, I have that scholarly bent. Maybe I could succeed in the imperial examinations, but then, they don't let girls take the exams. So yeah.
Well, you know a way around that now.
I could conquer my way to dominance, maybe. I don't know.
How about you? The time of the Great Gatsby. Would you? But again, you're just not going back to that time period. You're going to a time period where there's magics alive in that world.
While I honestly love the idea of being part of a troupe of paper cutting magicians, I'm going to say no because non-white women can't vote yet. And honestly, I can see people selling their souls every day of the week. I'm fine here, I think.
Tende, about yourself? Now you're actually living in Edinburgh, so you're someone else living your story.
But you know that thing they say about immigrants, they come to your country and they ruin everything, and that's the sort of like Edinburgh that you get. It's dirty, it's smelly, it's crime, high unemployment. It is pretty messed up. I wouldn't want to live in that version of Edinburgh that I created. No, I like a constant supply of electricity, man. I like Wi-Fi and all that.
Okay, we're running out of time. I always like to ask authors whenever I'm moderating a panel, because a lot of times people that are listening into these panels are people that want to be a writer. They're aspiring to walk into a Barnes and Noble and find their book shelved somewhere in that Barnes and Noble. Do you have any advice for those that might entertain, not necessarily just in fantasy, but maybe in fantasy in particular? Any advice you'd recommend? Any tidbit of information you want to share? Again, I'll just raise hands if anybody has right off the top, so I don't just throw you a left-wing question and then expect an immediate cogent answer. Anybody?
Just a little bit every day, or at least a few times a week adds up really quickly. I mean, you don't need to write a ton. You don't need to. It seems maybe insurmountable, but if you write 300 words a day, you'll have a book at the end of the year.
Nghi, you had your hand up there.
I was actually going to say you don't need to write every day, but you do need to finish stuff. It doesn't matter how good or bad it is. Finish it. Editing fixes everything.
Anybody else? Yes, Tende?
Still shamelessly read a lot, pinch whatever you can from whoever you love. Yeah.
Good answer. Yeah, whenever I answer that question, it's, I always, stick by both of what was just basically said is, the old adage is write every day. You should be, if you want to get your prose better, you need to practice. There's old adage, you need to write 1 million words before you should expect to be published. So start working on those 1 million words. So, write every day. But I also add the addendum to that, or the caveat, which is not only should you be writing every day, you should be reading every night. Because, no matter what book you read, good, bad, middle, you're going to learn something. That you're going to, especially if you're writing during the day, a problem forms in your head and not forms because you're having difficulty describing a character without looking in a mirror, or you're having difficulty with dialogue. But when you read at night, because that knot formed in your head, when you read at night, you see how that author handled that topic, and it begins to untie that knot. So I think anybody that writes every day and reads every night could become stronger and stronger, especially if they could read a certain 5 authors that are gathered in this panel right here. I think everybody would be much better off. And we are now running out of time completely. So again, thanks to everybody else for participating in the panel. Please, everybody out there, buy their books. You're going to get 5 different views on the fantasy genre. So you get an idea exactly how, what Brian said, that fantasy is a large umbrella. It can encompass many different genres. And if you're looking for doing something unique, find a way of blending genre. Finding ways of taking a little bit of horror and adding it to fantasy, or adding romance like Shelly did, and adding magic to it. So again, mix it up. So I'm going to end it right there because we're out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.